Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. Before we begin, couple of announcements. Number one, this coming Shabbos, we have the very special privilege of hosting Rabbi Chana Henkin, the founder of the Midrasha Nishmat Center for Advanced Torah Studies for Women, founder of the Yechezkel program, a world-renowned educator in Israel and elsewhere, and she will be here with us for Shabbos. So please come on out. We'll have a Oneg Shabbos at the home of the Swisas Friday night. And she'll be speaking Shabbos morning after davening on our family story, the price and privilege of living in Israel. The Rabbinita and her husband, Henkin, lost a daughter and a son-in-law to a terrorist attack not long ago. They will be speaking about both the price and the privilege of living in Israel. Saturday night, we have the next installment of our Mini-Med medical education series, My Bones and Joints Hurts. What can I do about it? Come Saturday night and find out. Dr. David Zook will be our moderator, so please come out for that. And Thursday night we begin our Smichat Chaver learning program, a full program of learning with tests, homework, and a certificate at the completion of the program. Serious business Thursday night, so come on out and join us.
Do you have to come to be present? Or
Yes, it's not recorded. No recordings. Okay, let us begin. Tonight, our third session, Sefer Shemot, the book of Exodus. Even though we're never going to use that English name again throughout the evening, we'll use lots of other different names. That's the name that everybody knows it as, Sefer Shemot. Tonight's class, in the entire lecture series, of course, in memory of Dr. Mark Weinberg, Zechron Levracha, and tonight's individual class has been sponsored by Simone Frankel in memory of Samuel Frankel, Shmuel ben Chaim David Justin. We wish his neshama and aliyah through the learning that we will do tonight. Okay, ready? So, as I was preparing how to address this sefer, this well-known sefer, lots of famous, well-known stories of Sefer Shmos, I was reminded of the Gemara, which we've quoted actually a number of times, that when the Septuagint, the Torah itself, was translated for the first time into Greek. So the Gemara records that King Ptolemy of Greece of Egypt really, had 70 different scholars brought into 70 different rooms, and he had each one of them translate the Torah into Greek. So this way he was able to verify, he wanted to see what was going to take place in their translations, and the Gemara records that a miracle happened, and all 70 scholars translated it, all of the Chachamim who were brought in, translated the exact same way. They all made the exact same slight changes in translation for various reasons, that they didn't want the Greek translation to reflect certain realities of what the Torah actually says, and they all made the exact same changes. That was the miracle that took place. And I was thinking, if you were to bring today 70 different rabbis, educators, teachers into separate rooms and say, prepare a 1-hour lecture on the book of Shemot, even if there would be a miracle, there's no way they would all come up with the same class, the same structure, the same highlights. What do you do with this book in a short amount of time? What do you highlight? What do you focus on? How do you structure it? So I say that because there are...
Just together in one room.
Forget about it. Well, they would be in separate rooms, of course. So there are, I'm sure, a dozen different ways to present this. So what you're going to get tonight is just one of them. It's just my best stab at it as to how to try to break down the book into a way of a synopsis. And what I'd like to do is really break the evening into two. Actually discuss a little bit, go through the Sefer in highlight form. That's on page 1. What I'm going to call this evening, we're going to call the evening 5 topics, 3 names, 1 theme. That's going to be the way that we're going to work through the book. 5 topics, 3 names, and 1 theme. Let's go through the 5 topics as a beginning. So what I did is I broke down the book into 5 topics. That's on page 1. You'll see the bold. The astute amongst you will notice there are actually 6. I am aware of that. Yes, thank you. I am aware. But you'll see that really 4 and 6 are 1. 4 and 6 are 1, so I considered it to be 5. The fact that they are bookends of something else is significant, and we will of course talk about that. But it's really basically 5 topics which you see clearly: servitude and redemption from Egypt, Har Sinai, a few selected laws, the commandment to build the Mishkan, the sin of the golden calf, and then actually building the Mishkan. So what I'd like to do is let's spend a few moments, let's go through. What I did is I inserted under each topic of the major 5 topics that are discussed a couple of highlights, which just for the sake of highlighting interesting or important themes that come out. And it's always interesting where here you have literally on one sheet of paper you have the entire book. Not quite the entire book, obviously there are a number of incidents which I did not include, but a summary of the entire book. We don't really have a chance to ever do this because we do it 1 week at a time as we go through the Parsha. We get it in little pieces, and we don't often have the time or the chance to scale back and look from a bird's eye view in a short amount of time of what really is the entire book about. So let's spend a few minutes doing that. So those are the 5 topics, then we'll do the three names, and then we'll do the one theme. So the book starts with the servitude, the affliction, and the redemption from Egypt. This takes up the bulk of the book, almost the entire first half of the book. It's about the entire book is about 40 chapters. So the first 18 of such address the servitude and affliction of the Jews, that what they experience in Mitzrayim. We mentioned last week already, the Ramban, we quoted it inside in your notes from last week, how the Ramban writes that when the beginning of the redemption happens, the Pasuk describes in a number of different phrases the crying out of the Jewish people. How they called, they screamed, they were in pain, and how their cries went up to heaven. The Ramban mentions there, we saw this last week already, that part of the story is that it was through tefillah, through the prayers of the Jewish people, that even though they hadn't yet achieved worthiness to be redeemed, but it was through their prayer that they were redeemed nonetheless. And so that's one of the important themes that comes out of this entire story. We're familiar with this, of course, from the Pesach story. We're told about the birth of Moshe and our introduction to him. I mention that because his birth, which is, of course, I wouldn't say miraculous, his birth comes about because his sister Miriam, the Torah tells us, well, really the Medrash describes through the Psukim how Miriam convinced her father Amram to remarry, because when the servitude had gotten so bad and all of the Jewish boys were being killed, so Amram, who was the leader of the Jewish people, felt it was better not to bring more children into such a world, such an evil world, such a world of such pain and suffering, and she makes the argument to him of, you're worse than Paro. Paro's only decreeing against the boys. Your decree will affect the boys and the girls. He remarries and Moshe is born. And I mention this because the sages find in so many different ways through these stories insights into giving us life lessons, hashkafa, the way that a Jew lives his life. And that lesson is so important, the birth of Moshe. That lesson of, you might think this is such an evil world. There's so much pain, there's so much suffering. How can I bring a child into such a world filled with such pain? And the sages put that argument into Amram, the leader of the Jewish people at the time, and his 6-year-old daughter says, but Abba, that's worse than Paro. The sages always in story form so often convey messages, values. Our job is raise children, have children, continue life, the circle of life. Yes, there's pain. Yes, there's suffering. Yes, sometimes it seems, but for what? That's not our business. That's the Rebbeinu Shalom's problem. That's not our problem. Our problem is always weiter, always forward, more, continue, develop in whatever way we have the ability to do so, but we always do so. And then our introduction to Moshe, the Torah records 3 consecutive stories in which Moshe, the great leader of the Jewish people, in what way are we introduced to him? In his interpersonal relationships. First, he breaks up a fight between an Egyptian and a Jew, and he stops the Egyptian, kills the Egyptian. Then the next day he goes out and he sees 2 Jews fighting, and he stops them. And then he runs to Midian and he stops 2 non-Jews fighting. The shepherds are beating up on what will be his future wife, the daughters of Yisro, and he stops them. And in 3 consecutive episodes, we see Moshe in the role, not of this great spiritual leader, Moshe in the role of peacemaker, one who's willing to insert himself, to stand up when he sees a problem. I mentioned this in Shabbos just because it fits into the parsha of the week. We just learned in the parsha of Vayera, which we read last week, how when the 2 angels come to visit Lot to pull him out of the city of Sodom, so the Torah describes that right after they got into Lot's house, the entire city of Sodom came to the door to surround the home. And the Torah uses the language of Kol Ha'am. The whole city came, Minar Vi'ad Zakein, from the old to the young, Mina Kotzeh, from one edge of the city right to the other. Everybody was there. And Rashi asks, every single person was there? Kol Ha'am, Minar Vi'ad Zakein, surrounding this one little house? How can it be? So Rashi says, Afilu echad eino mocha biyadam. There was nobody who protested. People saw there was a tumult, there was things going on, people running in the streets. What's going on? There are guests. And everybody was running, and nobody stood up and said, leave him alone. And if you don't protest when you see something wrong, it's considered as if you participated. So the Torah says everybody was there. Everybody wasn't there, but nobody stopped it, and it was considered as if you were there. And so our introduction to Moshe as the leader is the inserting of himself when there was a problem. That's how we were introduced to Moshe. We're then introduced to Hashem, or Moshe and Hashem are introduced to each other, I should say more accurately, by the burning bush, and the command to redeem the Jewish people, which of course, Moshe is the shepherd out looking for his sheep, and they have a whole dialogue in which Moshe actually refuses the request, and he says, not me. Hashem eventually gets angry at him and says, this is your job, this is your task, this is what you're here for, to send Moshe on his way. The Torah describes, of course, Moshe's return, just highlights his return to the people, and we see there, really what's worth noting, when Moshe comes back, tremendous hope. The people are excited. The Torah describes when they hear Moshe return with the prophecy that he's here to redeem them, they bow down, they prostrate, the Torah says, in joy and excitement. Hashem is coming as he had promised. And then what does it lead immediately to? Despair, because Paro sees that they're all getting excited, and he takes away their straw, makes it more difficult, and then we get the pasuk of how they couldn't listen to Moshe mikotze ruach. They didn't hear. They originally did. It's only when it then got worse that they can no longer hear his words of redemptive prophecy, mikotze ruach u'me'avodah kasha, which is just, again, and when you learn the highlight, sometimes right before the redemption, when you think it's there, and you get excited, and then it comes crashing down. And then the despair is even worse. And then the redemption flowers. There are patterns in Jewish history which are introduced to us through the story, which play themselves many, many times. Moshe goes to Paro, and the famous line, one of the most famous phrases that has begun, let my people go. The only problem with that phrase, and I heard this from Rabbi Menachem Liebtag in the Gush, said, that's really not what Moshe ever says. He never says, let my people go. He always says, let my people go and serve me. This is not just a story of let my people go. It's always, you have to finish the sentence. Let my people go and serve God. That's the sentence that Moshe always says, and sometimes that last phrase is dropped off. It's just a story of freedom, which it is, but it's a freedom to something. That's the Jewish always. Our lives are always, we want freedom to be able to serve God freely, not just to be able to drink pina coladas at the beach. We're then, of course, introduced to non-alcoholic, of course. Then we're introduced to the 10 plagues, which are in a series of 3 by 3 by 3, the set of the 10 plagues. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment, plus the 10th, the Makkos Bechoros. We're introduced to the Korban Pesach and the first mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh. I mentioned the first mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh because we also spoke about this prior in a previous week, in which the very first Rashi in all of Chumash says, why are we starting the Chumash from the story of Bereshis? We should have started it from the mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh. And what's so special about this mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh? It's the first mitzvah given to us as a people, as a nation. And there's something significant to that, Rashi. That's really where the Chumash should have started. And again, this idea that we became a nation with a mitzvah of declaring Rosh Chodesh, the final pursuit, of course, of the Egyptians as we left, the splitting of the sea, the singing of the song of Shira, and then a number of crises in the desert. There's no food, there's no water, we're attacked by Amalek, leads, of course, to many complaints, and all of the stories of the desert. That is the first 18 chapters in a few moments. Of what goes on, which is familiar. This is a story of, again, affliction, redemption, and entering into the desert. Chapters 19 and 20, which is the midpoint of the Sefer, we arrive at Har Sinai. This is, of course, a major story in the book, even though it doesn't have so much space. It's only 2 chapters. Preparation Moshe goes up and down the mountain many times to get us ready. The actual scene, which is set of the thunder and the lightning and the smoke and everything, the mountain shakes, and then the mass revelation of the Ten Commandments, which are significant not just because of the Ten Commandments, the Seres HaDibros, but the mass revelation, which is a major event in Jewish theology, the idea that the Torah describes a revelation of God's presence to a mass of people. There is not another religion in the world that claims that. No other religion dares to make such a claim that God revealed himself to more than one or two people. Because he can't. Because once you do that, then you could ask, you could prove, you could say. But if he only revealed himself to a couple of people, so those people, you either believe him or you don't believe him. So we never, this moment of the giving of the Torah at Har Sinai, where Hashem reveals himself, and the Torah describes how you all saw, we have that as we're the only ones to even make such a claim. After the giving of the Torah at Har Sinai, we move to the third story, the selected laws and mitzvos, Parshas Mishpatim. 4 chapters worth. About 50 or so mitzvahs are given in Parshas Mishpatim. So we went from all the stories of Bereshis, the stories of the beginning of Sefer Shmos, and then we hit Parshas Mishpatim, and we get law after law after law, about 50 or so, as I mentioned. Most of those laws are ben adam lechavero, between man and fellow man. For example, the story of Jewish slaves setting the first mitzvah, that's what, after you set them free after 6 years. Damages, if you own property, animals, or you're digging a pit, leaving things along that people trip on, setting fire, caring for the widow, the orphan, and the stranger, which is a phrase that appears many, many times in the Torah, hager vayasom va'almana, the requirement to take care of those who don't have those to take care of themselves, to help them. So we are obligated as a community to take care of them. The mitzvah of giving a loan, not collecting interest, all of that is addressed in that section. Then we have the fourth section, which is the commandment to build a Mishkan, which includes the contribution of money, the contribution of materials, and the contribution of actual labor. Some people gave money, some people gave goods, and some people gave of their skill, which is what we always need as well as in any building of a community. I've mentioned it before, it's not my line, but every shul is made up of the 3 P's. You're either a payer, a player, or a prayer. But if you want to be part of a shul community, you choose. You can do more than one. It's okay. I give you permission to do more than one. But you have to be either a player, meaning you're on the board, you're involved in activities, you arrange, you show up. You're a player. Or you're a payer. Okay, maybe you don't come so often, but you help support. And if you can't support, and you can't be on, but you're a prayer. Someone's got to be a mincha shachas mincha mar, shachas mincha mar. A shul only functions that when some people come once a year for a yard site, there's a minyan. Well, why is there a minyan when they come? Because there are a group of people, 15, 20, 25, whatever. Come snow, water, rain. They are the rain. That's what makes up a community. So just pick one. Pick one. You pick 2, pick 3. Ideally, pick 3. But you gotta be one of the 3. So we already see that in the Mishkan. There were those who donated their money, those who donated the resources, there were those who donated their ability to come and be craftsmen. You gotta choose one. Everybody, I'm sure, were prayers back then. But that's how it goes. Okay, then we build the Mishkan, and you have also the command to produce the garments. After we receive that command, we have the sin of the golden calf. This major event in Jewish history. Moshe's late coming down from Har Sinai. He's late because of a miscalculation of when the people thought he was going to come down, which is also a great little story throughout Jewish history. How many problems do we have because of a miscalculation? Sometimes we have fights, and it's a fight because there's what to fight about. Like we're all on the same page, and you think this way and I think that way, and it leads to a debate, a dispute, whatever it may be. How many problems have we had simply because of just a miscalculation? Somebody was just off on their numbers, on their timing, and that's really what this was about. Aharon, Moshe's brother, is pressured to do something. He ends up collecting gold, throwing it into a fire, and the golden calf emerges. The people dance. Hashem and Moshe up on the mountain. Hashem says to Moshe, it's time for you to go down. We got problems. Moshe comes down. He sees the Jews dancing, and he smashes the luchos. He then asks, Mila Hashem Elai. Now there's like this retribution for those who are dancing around the golden calf, and the tribal Levi steps forward. Very important incident because this changes the dynamic of leadership of the Jewish people for all, at least until this point in history, where it had been the firstborns, and it's taken away from them and given instead to the tribal Levi, who will become Kohanim, Leviim, through this episode of the golden calf. And then Moshe, of course, intercedes on our behalf. He goes back up to the mountain and he prays. We are taught at this point the 13 attributes of mercy. Hashem, Hashem, Kel Racham V'Chanun. We are given forgiveness on which day? On Yom Kippur, correct? And we are given a second set of luchos. That second set is fundamentally different than the first set. First set was hewn out by Hashem himself, written by Hashem himself. The second set, Moshe does, Moshe writes. And even though we are now given a second set, nothing is exactly the same. And the Gemara has a whole discussion about what would have been had we been given the first set of luchos and would have retained it, but we did not, and instead we have the second set. We did keep the first set, the broken ones, in the Aron. Were kept in the Aron and traveled with the Jewish people the first set, which is also just an important little insight that even the first thing that were broken, but we kept the broken pieces. You don't throw away broken pieces. Even that had a certain value. We kept that with us always as well. But things would never be the same, and we still deal with the ramifications of the sin of the golden calf. And then the book concludes with the building of the Mishkan, chapters 35 through 40, in which we actually build and produce. Just one last note on that. So Rashi and the Ramban, two major commentators, argue as to why is the sin of the golden calf inserted in the midst of sections D and F, the commandment to build the Mishkan, and then the actual construction. It's a funny place for it. So Rashi points out that sometimes the Torah goes out of order, and that was the case over here. And really, the Mishkan, the building of the Mishkan, was only a response to the sin of the golden calf. Because of the sin of the golden calf, we needed a more tangible, permanent place to direct our prayers, to direct our service. And so we were given the Mishkan after the failure of the sin of the golden calf. Whereas the Ramban understands that, read it in the order that it was given. We were given the commandment to build the Mishkan before the sin of the golden calf, and the Rabban understands that it was a different purpose, which we will get to in a few moments. It was the continuation of Har Sinai, to have a permanent place, to continuously have a place, not as a result of the sin. It was always intended to be that way, and I just mentioned that briefly, but that's beyond really what we're going to be focused on tonight. Okay, that was a short 15-20 minute review of Sefer Shemot as far as what happens in this particular book. As we start from Egypt, we start with servitude and affliction, travel through the desert, Har Sinai, giving of the Torah, series of mitzvahs, building the Mishkan, and of course the sin of the golden calf. Okay, any questions on that? No, great. As I mentioned last week, the real goal of this entire lecture series, I'm totally open, just up front. The real goal is so that on Wednesday at noon and Thursday at Shabbos mornings at 12, at 9:40, 8:40, before davening, so that this one's like, I need to do verse by verse. You can't, this is just too fast, there's too much. Yeah, that's true, it's too much, it's too fast, so we'll go through it piece by piece as we go through. Okay, that's a little brief synopsis of the things which take place. Now, using that as a background, let's go to section 2 for tonight. So we did the 5 topics which we've just covered. Again, Mitzrayim, receiving the Torah, the laws, sin of the golden calf, the Mishkan. 3 names. 5 topics, 3 names, 1 theme. What are the 3 names? So this book has quite a number of names, which is significant in terms of trying to draw our attention or highlight aspects of this particular book. Now, the name that we're most familiar with and that we refer to, is on the topic that we called it, is the book of Sefer Shemot, which literally means the book of names. Now, where does that name come from? So that name comes from the very back of your sheet, the very last page. You'll see the very first pasuk in the book. And the first pasuk starts, Ve'ele Shemos B'nei Yisrael Habaim Mitzrayim. These are the names of the B'nei Yisrael that came down to Mitzrayim. It's Yaakov, together with Yaakov, Ish Uveso Bo. Each man came together with his household. And then the Torah lists Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar, and all the 12 sons of Yaakov who went down to Mitzrayim. Now that is a repeat of what we saw at the end of the Sefer Bereshis that we studied last week. By the time Bereshis ends, where are the Jewish people? They're in Mitzrayim. They've been there for a long time already. Yaakov's been there 17 years. Yaakov dies. The Torah describes all the brothers then die. Yosef then dies. And he leaves his brothers and their children one final message before he dies, which we learned about last week, which is, Hashem is going to remember you and take you out of here. So when that book last week, when Sefer Bereshis ends, they've been in Mitzrayim, I'm getting 7, 30, 40, a number of years already. That's where they've been. Sefer Shmos then begins, Ve'ela Shemot, going back to the original tribes who came down, who have all already died. All of them. And that's how Sefer Shmos begins. Rashi makes the following comment. I apologize, I meant to put it on your sheet and I forgot. Rashi comments, why are we told their name? We know their names. Many times we've known their names again. So Rashi says, I'll just read it for you quickly. Rashi says, Afal pi shimonon b'chayehem b'shmosam. They were named already. They were listed by name during their lifetimes at the end of Sefer Bereshis. Chazar uma'anon b'misasam. They are counted again after they've died. Lahodia chibatam. To make it known how beloved they are. Shenimshalu lekoichavim, that they were compared to stars, shemotziim umachnisim b'mispar uvishmosam, who are taken out and brought in every night with their number and their name, as we say, we mention in davening every day. The pasuk that Rashi quotes, hamotzi b'mispar tzivam l'chulam b'shem yikari, they're called names. So Rashi comments, what's the idea of counting somebody by name? What does it mean to count somebody by name?
Their importance.
Correct. Their importance and their love. The feeling that you have to them. When you count somebody by name, you give them an identity. You give them something that's of value, as opposed to, and this is one of the things which you hear a lot. We're actually showing one of the films that we're having on our Saturday night film festival this year. I think the third one we're going to show is, I forgot the exact name of it, Numbered, I think it was called, right? And it's about survivors telling their story about what it was like after the war with their numbers. How did it identify them? How did they not let it identify them? How did they move? But that's a sentiment which we're all unfortunately very familiar with. The idea of taking a person and not being a name and making them into just a number. That's the, I don't say the worst. It's hard to use any term worse when you any reference the Holocaust. But that was an element that it's a very powerful element of the Holocaust. And so on the flip side, when you count somebody and you call them by name, it's a display of love, of individuality. It's the difference between the two blessings that we've mentioned this before. Avram is giving two blessings. We saw this many, many times last week. He's given two things that he's compared to. One are the stars up in heaven, and he's compared to the sand. And we spoke about this before. What's the difference between them? If God just wants to say, you're going to be numerous, so say you'll be numerous. Choose one. Why does he give us both of those parables? That you'll be like the stars, and you'll be like the sand. What's the difference between being compared to a star and being compared to sand?
People walk on ice.
Well, let's talk. Would you ever give sand a name, a grain of sand?
No.
Why not?
There were too many of them.
More than that.
That's nothing.
Because it's insignificant. You couldn't, there's no reason to give a grain of sand a name because it's meaningless as a singular grain. What is it? It's gone, you lose it in a second. They're all the same. There's nothing identify it. Its only value is in numbers. If you have millions, billions of grains of sand, you could do something with it. It has value. Sometimes we're compared to sand. We'll be like the sand and we'll have numbers, we'll have value as that. But a greater blessing is to be compared to the stars. Stars are given names. In the scientific world today, every star is identified because every star is a world unto itself. It's a value to be able to identify to those who study it, this one versus that one. And that's what we're compared to. The book begins, Ve'ele Shemot B'nei Yisrael, to show us our loves. So the first name of the book, that's the most popular, common name that Chazal used, the book of Shemos, is the book of names, which is interesting because really what happens in this book? What transformation do we go through from the beginning of the book to the end of the book? We go through a small family
To a nation.
to a nation. We're a family. We actually begin with the 12 tribes. We go back to the actual 12 sons who come down. But by the time we finish this book, those 12 sons have become 12 tribes, each one with tens of thousands of when they're numbered and counting. We're 600,000 just men between 20 and 60. And yet the book begins with name. Book of names, of individuality, of significance to each and every one of the nation that's going to be formed from the family into the group of names. That's the most popular, common name of this book. It's called Sefer Shemot. But there are two other names that this book is referenced as, and I think it's important as we go through our second section tonight to go through, because these two other names really define a lot about what the book is about. Now, if I would introduce, before we get there, when you go over the 5 topics that we spoke about previously on page number 1, what would you say is the most central or climax of that story? And I ask that from a literary perspective. There are 2 ways. If you have a lot of writing, major 40 different chapters, there are 2 ways that you can structure it as to what you would highlight to be the most important part of it. What would be your 2 literary ways of writing it if you wanted to highlight something as the most important? Either you put it at the end, it's the climax, we've reached the conclusion of everything that I've been writing, and this is it, this is the conclusion, the climax of everything that we've been working towards. Or there's another literary structure, which puts either the beginning or I would say in the mid, right in the middle. Something that we call what's the word I'm looking for? I'm blanking out, a chiasmatic? Rabbi David Firmer likes to refer to that a lot. I forget the exact name of it. Chiasm, right? Where you structured A, B, C, B, A. So when you look at it, and the theme, you start with one theme of A, another theme of B, C, and then you go back to B and back to A. When you scale back, you say, oh, it's clear. What's the most important thing? That which is happening right in the middle is what's being highlighted. That's the structure of how you could write a poem, a story, whatever it may be. So if you look at this book, the 40 chapters, what's in the middle? Chapter 20. Getting the Torah is the center, literal center of the book. What's the end of the book? The building of the Mishkan and Hashem's presence filling it. Which, if you had to choose, is the Torah trying to highlight as the goal, the centerpiece of this book, getting to the end? Or is it that middle, right in the middle there, Har Sinai? Which one is it? So what I'd like to show you is that there are 2 approaches as to what to call this book, and depending on what you'll see what you call it, will reflect this storyline that takes place within the book and what's being highlighted. Let's start with the Ramban, Nachmanides, who lived in the 1100s, 1200s in Spain, and one of the most classic commentators that we have, Rabbeinu Nachman. The Ramban writes, I brought it, it's on page 3. Let's take a look at it. 2, sorry. 2, bottom of page 2, thank you. Bottom of page 2. This is the Ramban's own introduction to Sefer Shemot. In his commentary to Chumash, he wrote introductions to each of the Svarim. This is number 1. This is of Sefer Shemot, book number 2. The Torah completed the book of Bereshis, he writes, which is the Sefer HaYitzira, the book of creation, which is obviously named for its obvious meanings, which concerns the creation, of course, the world, and the formation of all of its creatures, as well as the events of the Avos, of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, because all of the events in their lives are illustrations to allude and foretell that which will happen to their offspring. Maaseh Avos, Siman Labanim, as we've mentioned before, that which takes place to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, we'll replay. That's why we learned, we spoke about this last week, the events which took place, we see them happening over and over and over again in history. Says the Ramban, that's what we completed last week. After the Torah completed the Sefer Yetzirah creation, began another book, the book of Shemos. So that Yetzirah creation is done, and now we move into the Sefer, which is about Geula, Galus and Geula, about exile. It's dedicated to the first exile which was explicitly decreed to Avram, and the redemption from it. Avram was promised, as we read about last week in the Parsha, Ger yezarecha b'aretz lo lahem, your children will be strangers in a land that's not theirs. Arba meo shana, for 400 years. Then there'll be servitude, and there'll be ve'inu, they'll be afflicted. All of that's going to happen, and then I'm going to take them out. So that idea of exile, galus, and geula, and redemption. This is why, says the Ramban, the Torah goes back and begins the book with the names of those who descended from Egypt, even though it has already been recorded. Ramban asked the same question we saw in Rashi. Why are you mentioning their names? Ve'ela Shemos. These are their names. We know their names already. What did Rashi say? To tell us how beloved they are, that we want to call them by name. We want to list them again. Says Ramban, I'll tell you why I understand the Torah lists them again. Because their descent marks the beginning of the exile, for it was at this point that it began. The book begins with the brothers coming down. We're in Egypt already. Why do we list it again? Something fundamental happened when the brothers came down to Egypt, and that is, exile began. You want to know when did it start? When the brothers all left their home in Canaan and joined Yosef in Egypt, that's when exile started. What is this book about? Exile, says the Ramban. So you have to start the book with exile. You can't start in the middle of being in Egypt already. You have to go back to the beginning when they first came down. When did exile end? This is an important question. When does the Egyptian exile end? One can come up with a number of answers to that question. Give me the first point in time, first point where you can make an argument that exile ended.
Chodesh, mitzvat HaChodesh.
Getting a mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh. What else?
With Moshe?
With what?
When Moshe came back, already it's the beginning.
Okay, beginning. Really, when you say end, how about bringing the carbon pasta or leaving? Leaving. And if you don't like leaving, how about the splitting of the sea? When we got the Torah. All of those would have been fine answers as to answering the question, when did exile end? Listen to the Ramban. Again, when does the book begin? Why does the book begin with the names? Because that's when exile began, when they came down. Says the Ramban, the exile did not end. Ad shuvam el mikomam ve'el ma'alat avotam. So the people returned to their place and to the stature of their forefathers. Now that is an important phrase. Many people talk about the Ramban. The redemption did not end until they returned to the stature, the ma'ala of avotam. Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, prophets, who spoke to Hashem. He continues, therefore, even though they left Egypt and the house of bondage, they were still considered exiles, for they were wandering in a land not theirs. But when they arrived at Har Sinai and built the Mishkan, and then Hashem caused His presence to dwell amongst them, then they returned to the eminence of their forefathers, and they were considered redeemed. This is why the book ends with the divine presence filling the Mishkan. Very important Ramban. If you ask the Ramban, when did the exile end? He would say, when the Mishkan was built, and the divine presence rests with the Jewish people, they are now on the same level as Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Now they are a redeemed people. We spoke about this a number of times because of the discussion which we're living through today, right now. When are the Jewish people redeemed? So we've returned to the land. Half of the world Jewish population is back in the land. Are we redeemed? So we are, I believe in it, we can talk about this for many, many other hours, on the way. But has Hashem's presence returned to the Jewish people? Not yet. How do we know? Many reasons, but one is because there's a mosque still sitting on Rabbi. So as long as that's there, I feel pretty confident saying that Hashem's presence has not yet returned. We can all be back in the land of Israel, and I think it would be safe to say, according to the Ramban, we will still not be redeemed until the Beis HaMikdash is rebuilt and Hashem's presence has returned. And we would have what to say. That doesn't mean that every step along the way is not a step along the process. But when is it over? So the Ramban says, where is the highlight of this book? He would say, the very last pasuk of this sefer. When this sefer ends, Vayimalei kvod Hashem es ha-mishkan. Hashem's presence filled the Mishkan. That's redemption. Getting the Torah was the step along the way to get the command to build the Mishkan. Remember, the Ramban holds that the Mishkan was not a response to the sin of the golden calf. It was always supposed to be that way. It's a continuation of the experience of Har Sinai having a permanent place, and Hashem's presence will fill the Mishkan. And when Hashem's presence fills the Mishkan for the first time, our book ends. We're going to go into Sefer Vayikra. This book comes to an end because this is the book of Golus and Geula, exile and redemption. It begins with Eila Shmos of the 12 tribes coming down. That's when Golus started. And Golus ends with Hashem's presence filling the Mishkan, and that's how our book closes. The giving of the Torah, which of course is the most significant thing, but that's not the end of exile. It's just the most significant event we ever experienced. Exile ends when Hashem's presence rejoins and we are together with Him the way that our forefathers were. That's the second name that we found. Sefer Shmos is the most common name. The Ramban would call it the Sefer Golus v'Geula, the book of exile and redemption. So far, so good. One more name that this book is known as, not as common. It's known as, get ready for this, the second book. That's not a joke, not a joke. It's called the second book. If you flip to page 3, it's a long page, so we're not going to read the whole thing together, but I gave it to you if you do want to read the whole thing. The Netziv, Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, was one of the Rosh Yeshiva of the Yeshiva in Volozhin. He passed away in 1893. He gave a shir Friday mornings. He would give a chumash shir, and it was eventually written down into the sefer known as the Emek Davar, which is a oft-studied book today. And he wrote introductions to also, like the Ramban, to the various books. So he wrote an introduction to Sefer Shmos. We actually referenced his introduction last week as well to Sefer Bereshis. So he quotes from the Baal Halachos Gedolos, the Bahag, one of the earlier authorities, and he quotes from the Bahag in the first paragraph, who referred to this book as the second book. And he wrote, when he writes the Bahag, that there are 5 books of the Torah. There's Sefer Bereshis, Chumash Sheni, the second book. Then it's Sefer Kohanim, the book of the priests, which is Sefer Vayikra next week. Chumash HaPekudim, the book of Numbers for Sefer Bamidbar. And Mishnah Torah, the repetition. So he names each one of the books, and only one of the books doesn't get a name. Only the book of Shemot does not get a name, it just gets the second book. So the Netziv asks, why did this Bahag, is a well-known authority, when he lists the 5 books, what's the pshat that he couldn't come up with anything for this most important book in which so many major events happened in Jewish history, and all he could come up with was the second book. Okay, so if you want to call the second, then list the 3rd, the 4th, and the 5th. But no, the 3rd gets a name, the 4th gets a name, and the 5th gets a name. What's the meaning of calling it the second book? So he writes, we need to see just 2 other sources before we get to what he writes. If you look to the back page again, 2 sources from Rashi. Source number 2, Rashi in the beginning of Bereshis. Let me go to source number 3 actually first. The 3rd source, which is the first Rashi in Chumash, on the first pasuk. Rashi says, what is the word Bereshis bara? He says this pasuk requires explanation, and he quotes from Chazal that Bishvil, the way that you should read Bereshit, is as if it's made up of 2 words, Bishvil Bereshit. I created the world for that which is called the first. So Bereshit means before, or Bishvil, for, on behalf of that which is Reshit. What's called Reshit? What's called the first? Chazal quote 2 things. Number 1, Torah is called Reshit, Bishvil HaTorah, Shenikra is Reshit Darko. Ubishvil Yisrael Shenikra'u Reishis Tvuasa. We find in various psukim the Jewish people are called Reishis, the first, and Torah is. So that Chazal quote, Bit Reishit Bara. Why did God create the world? He created the world before the Torah and for the Jewish people. One more source. Above that, source number 2. The end of the 6th day of creation, the Torah says, Vayer vayivoker yom ha-shishi. It was evening and it was morning, the 6th day, yom Hashishi. Now, all the other days did not have that hey before it. It was Yom Echad, Yom Sheni, Yom Shlishi, Revi, Chamishi, but then it's Hashishi, the sixth day. Rashi gives two explanations. What is it about the sixth day? Rashi says, it's Erev Shabbos, of course Erev Shabbos. Lishon L'chol Ben Shabbos.
The day that the Torah was given.
Correct. Says Rashi, explanation number one. The letter Hey, the additional Hey, has the numerical value of 5, which is added to the word Shishi, so that when the world was completed, Hisne Imam, Hashem made a deal or a stipulation, a Tanai with the world, that it would only exist on condition that the Jewish people would receive the 5 books of the Chumash when the time came. So to speak, when Hashem finished creating the world on the 6th day, it was Ha-Shishi, because we're waiting to make sure that the Jews accept the 5 books of the Chumash. If they accept it, great, but if not, then this whole thing is not really going to continue. Or, Ha-Shishi means the 6th. Not basing itself on the number 5, the but the 6th refers to the 6th day of Sivan, which was the day that the Torah was given. And Rashi says similarly, everything was hanging in the balance until the 6th day, which was destined to be the day that the Torah was created. If we would accept it, great, and if not, we'll just drop the whole, we don't need this world. Both ideas, which you get into why Rashi quotes them both, they seem to be saying something very similar. But what's the idea? That creation itself was hanging in the balance, waiting for the Torah to be given. Says the Netziv, back to page 3. Says the Netziv, how the sages describe that that's why the world was created. Let's go to the second paragraph, the underlined piece. The understanding of this is that the purpose of the world's creation as a whole was for a single nation to become God's possession, His nation. And that, of course, is us. This did not completely come to fruition until Israel left Egypt, arriving at their purpose when, upon accepting the yoke of the Torah and the mitzvahs, they experienced a transformation of their very being. When did that purpose become fulfilled? The purpose of why the world was created. When the Jewish people stand at Har Sinai and accept the Torah, we become the Am HaNivchar, the chosen nation, to fulfill the purpose of all of creation. And at that moment, when we take upon ourselves Torah and mitzvos, and we become transformed from being a family and just a nation to now being a holy nation, a nation with purpose, a nation with meaning, a nation with mission in this world. Thus, going to the third paragraph, the underline, the beginning of the third paragraph. Thus, the Exodus from Egypt was the culmination of creation, specifically at the giving of the Torah, as the Medrash says, which we quoted, that the whole world was waiting for Israel, the Jewish people, to accept the Torah. How is the Netziv looking at, based on the Baha'i, what happens? What's the centerpiece of this book? The giving of the Torah, which completes the story of creation. The story of creation was not done when Bereshis ended. When Sefer Bereshis ended and the Jewish people are in Mitzrayim, the story of creation isn't done. Creation's not finished, because creation will only be finished when the nation, us, are given the tools and the gift with which we need to bring God's name to the world and fulfill the world's purpose. Then creation has been completed. Thus, going down to the fourth paragraph, thus, the giving of the Torah completed creation. It is really the same as the Exodus from Egypt, for only through the Exodus could Israel be capable of receiving the Torah. I mean, we need that, and that's the actualization of the purpose of their formation. And he writes that even if a person doesn't yet have, just like we didn't yet have the Torah, but it's only through the Torah that's the ultimate purpose of Israel's stature. We're created for this purpose. It's the reason we have been placed on this earth for the covenant of the people. And he concludes, and therefore it follows why the book of Shemot is considered the second book. It doesn't get its own name. Why? It's just finishing that which we started. It's the second. All the other books get a name because it has a different goal in mind. But the second book is really just the completion of the first, dealing with the same thing, two parts that describe creation. Now, according to the Netziv's understanding from the Bahag, the Sefer Rabbi Halachos Gedolos, what's the structure of the book? What's the highlights?
The end.
Right? No. According to the Netziv, it's right there in the middle.
Oh, see.
Right? The chapter 20, the giving of the Torah. That is the center of the book, is the centerpiece of what this is about, the culmination of all of creation. The whole world is waiting for that moment. Creation is hanging in the balance. Now we've been given our mission. Now, 2 points on that, really on both the Ramban. So we have Sefer Shemot, the book of names, the love, the individuality of every name. The Ramban is the book of redemption and exile and redemption. And the Netziv, based on the Bahag, is really about the book of receiving the Torah, which is really the book of completing all of creation. 2 things. According to the Ramban, the idea of bringing the Shekhinah, the divine presence, back to the Jewish people. He used the language which we mentioned of returning to Ma'alos Avosam, to the eminence of our fathers. Which means we already had that with Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. We were there, and now what did we need to do? Now we needed to take what was for individuals and get there as a people, as a nation. And that's how the book concludes with the Shekhinah, the divine presence, coming back to the Mishkan. We now achieved what had been achieved by individuals, now has been achieved by the entirety of the people. In the Nitziv's understanding, it's all about the giving of the Torah. That's the highlight. That's the centerpiece. The Maral asks a question, which again I mentioned this a number of times. I apologize for repeating myself. The Maral asks, if Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov were so great, why didn't they get the Torah? Very simple question. Why is it that Avram is given promises, Yitzchak promises, Yaakov promises, and then it's this people without prophecy? They're not like Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, enslaved, complainers. We see what goes on. Why do they get the Torah? And it's bypassed from Avram. Let them have it and then be slaves with the Torah already. Why? And he says a very fundamental answer. He says because the Torah does not belong to any individual.
Have to be a nation.
You cannot give the Torah to anything other than Am Yisrael, Klal Yisrael. And until we became a nation, even if we were a nation on a lower spiritual level than Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, it didn't matter. We were a nation, and only a nation can receive the Torah. And in the Nitziv's perspective, this third idea, that the centerpiece of this book is the giving of the Torah, we see that idea also, that it was as becoming, not just on the level of an Avraham as individuals, but when we became a nation, and we come out of Mitzrayim as a nation, and we receive the Torah, that's the completion of creation. Not Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Creation is completed with the nation of the Jewish people being formed, and receiving the Torah, which they only could do as a nation. Now we put a close to the book of creation. Now we are a people. And then the book just concludes with the building of the Mishkan, a couple of laws, but that's the essence of it is the receiving of the Torah. Okay, so far so good. That's 5 topics, 3 names, and now we're up to 1 theme. Now, that's really a little bit preposterous to try to say there's really only 1 theme. 1 theme that I want to talk about, how about that? That's a more accurate description of that. The 1 theme that I think needs to be addressed is that of, as you have on your sheet, top of page 2, miracles. The role of miracles. Miracles play a major part in this book. More than any other book, from beginning to end. It begins right away with Hashem introducing himself to Moshe, and where he says, the people aren't going to believe me, and Hashem says, I'll give you a bunch of signs that they'll believe you. He puts his hand in his pocket, it comes out with tsaras, he throws water on the earth and it becomes blood, and he throws a stick and snake. We have miracles in which Hashem introduces himself to Moshe. Moshe conveys those miracles to Paro. We of course have the 10 plagues, which is one miracle after another, the splitting of the sea, Har Sinai itself, all the miracles and the events which take place, and then the entire desert is filled with man falling from heaven and birds flying in to provide meat, well that travels miraculously with them, miracles out throughout the whole book. the role of that is significant. All of our holidays, Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkot, Yom Kippur, are all in this one book. This one book is the storyline of all of our Yom Tovim. Rosh Hashanah is the only one that's out of that because that's for the creation of the world. Yom Kippur we mentioned when Moshe comes down in our Sinai with the news that we've been forgiven, and he gives us a second set of luchos. That's in this sefer. Pesach is obviously in the sefer. Shavuos is the giving of the Torah, and our Sinai is in the sefer. Sukkot, that we travel through the desert, and it's particularly according to the Vilna Gaon, who learns that the yontif of Sukkot is the building of the Mishkan and the return of the clouds of glory which we had lost after the sin of the golden calf, is the yontif of Sukkot, which happened in the beginning of the Mishkan, the 15th of Tishrei. All of the Yom Tovim are this book, all commemorating the miracles which took place, the events of Yetzias Mitzrayim of the Midbar. What is this particular role? So I want to share with you in the few moments that we have left a Ramban. The Ramban is very long. I even shortened it for you. We're not going to read the whole thing together, but if you have your glasses with you and you can see that small font, I tried to fit it all into one page. On page 4, you have a Ramban. There's a very well-known and oft-quoted Ramban. We've quoted it, different pieces of it, because there's so much in here. We can highlight different pieces of it. This is the final Ramban in Parshas Bo. The Ramban is discussing the mitzvah of tefillin, is the springboard. He has about the same length of what I quoted here, which I did not bring at all, in which he discusses the mitzvah of tefillin, while we have the mitzvah of tefillin and the meaning of that. And after discussing the mitzvah of tefillin, he says, let me take this time to explain to you so many mitzvahs that we have to do with Zecher L'Tzias Mitzrayim. So many things all recall Mitzrayim that we do throughout the year, not just on the Yom Tovim, but specifically throughout the year. So he says, I'll tell you a general rule about the explanation of the mitzvahs. And he begins in his first paragraph and he says, throughout history, there have been deniers of God's presence in this world. And he quotes the 3 classic categories. Some deny that there is a creator at all. They think that the world has always existed and always will exist. There's no such thing as a creator. And others who say, yeah, there was a creator once who created the world, but he